Over the past year, I was able to learn a ton of no-code tools. For instance, I learned Bubble, I learned Appgyver, Adalo, Glideapps, Thunkable, Backendless, and a bunch of other tools. And I was able to do it in record time. And so in this video, I want to show you how you can learn any tool, any no-code tool in record time. I'm going to be showing you techniques that will allow you to pick up any tool, a new tool perhaps, very, very quickly and easily, and even enhance your knowledge of an existing tool. So for instance, if you already have some knowledge of a tool that you're using right now, my methods and techniques are going to be super useful for you in order to strengthen and take that knowledge to the next level. So let's begin. So the first thing you guys have to understand is that no-code tools are relatively simple. They're not rocket science. They're not, like learning a very, very difficult programming language. They're fairly simple if you follow these very easy rules. So the first thing you have to understand is that tools are really created upon this architecture. We have a UI. This is the UI. This is what we're interfacing with. And I'm going to show all of that in a bunch of examples in a second. We have a controller workflow logic, okay? And we have data, okay? When you are starting with a tool or you want to strengthen your knowledge in an existing tool that you're already using, you always want to start with the UI. So let me show you what I mean. So let's say I'm starting with Bubble. I've never used Bubble before. You can ignore all these apps. And I want to really understand how Bubble works. And I want to get started, hit the ground running, so to speak, with Bubble and start building apps. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say new app, right? I want to create a new app. I want to see what it's like. I'm going to say new sample app. And I'm going to fill all of this out just to get, just to make sure I can do it. What is the goal? Build the tool. And I'm going to say create a new app. And this workflow is pretty much the same in every single tool. Okay, it's very, very similar, if not exactly the same. And so here I have a sample app in Bubble. Okay, so imagine I've never seen this before. What I want to do now is I want to study the UI. I want to understand what are the possibilities, what are the things that I can do. And you want to pay close attention to this thing here, the grouping. You want to look at visual elements. You want to look at containers. You want to look at input forms. Okay, so the difference between the visual elements and input forms is that input forms actually take data, right? You can input data, whereas visual elements are read-only. And so the idea is that if you have an input form, you can overwrite data. You can write data or overwrite existing data. Whereas visual elements just display data. This is very, very important to understand. The other thing that I'm looking at is I'm looking for a repeating group or something similar to that, right? Because when you're doing something and you want to display a lot of data, right? It's one thing if you want to display like a piece of text. Okay, that's one thing. That's cool. That's important. And we're going to get to that. Another thing you're going to be doing a lot is you're going to be displaying lots of data, a list. Maybe, some kind of a dashboard, something where you need lots and lots of data. So let's say I have, users, right? I can just go to user and I have this and I can say data source, right? Get our users, whatever, parent groups thing, whatever. It doesn't matter what we're going to be doing. I can get data from an external API. It doesn't matter. I can say anything. But the point is I need something that's going to display it. Now, in every single tool, this repeating group is very important. This is what makes no-code super easy. It's really not these things, right? Because these things are, a dime a dozen. The star of the show is this repeating group. That's kind of what I'm looking at. And you're going to find this repeating group in Appgyver. You're going to find it in Adalo. You're going to find it everywhere. You're going to find a list. You're going to find something similar. Because when I started to do no-code, I found out about this repeating group. I discovered it, and I realized how powerful this is. Because this is the magic here. So that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at elements. I'm looking for a repeating group or something that's analogous to it. Something that does the same thing, essentially. The next thing I'm doing is I am looking at visual elements. So let's say we have this text. and I want to understand how do I edit it and how do I display actual data from a database, okay? So with Bubble, the way Bubble does it is if I choose this thing and I click here, I have something called dynamic data. This is very important because this is what creates code. We're not talking about workflows. We're not talking about logic just yet. We're not there yet, but we're getting there because yes, I can say like, hello world, right? Something very typical that every developer writes. I can do hello world. I can remove style and I can center it here. But that's, that's a static piece of text. If I want to display something dynamic, well, I need to go in here and I need to say insert dynamic data, and I can say current user's email, right? If I'm logged in. In Bubble, this is accomplished with something called dynamic data. In Appgyver, it's something else. It's called the binding. In Adalo, it's called a magic text. Every single tool has a way of doing it, and they call it, they call it by whatever name they want it. They call it by a specific name. And that is why when I'm looking at this tool, I already know what to look for. I know that, okay, listen, okay, how do I do that? How do I do dynamic data? Okay, in Bubble is dynamic data. Then I go to Adalo. Adalo is called magic text. In Appgyver is called a binding. Every tool has its own way, okay? I'm not going to show you every tool. I'm just telling you, I'm giving you the blueprint so that you can learn every tool. And so that's the next thing I'm doing. I'm looking at dynamic data. And Bubble is very, very rich when it comes with dynamic data. I have access to all kinds of data. I have options. I have external API. I have a drop-down, all these things. And, a lot of tools, they do the same thing. Exactly. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm also looking at additional functionality. So one thing you guys got to understand is that you have something called primitives. Primitives are your basic elements. So like a text, a button, an icon, a link, an image. These are primitives. And then you also have more complex elements. So something like a map, something like a video, an HTML. These are a little bit more complex, okay? And the primitives are going to be the same with every tool pretty much, right? You're going to have your text, you're going to have your button, you're going to have a link, you're going to have an image, right? Every tool is going to have these things. Whereas the complex elements are going to differ, right? Here we have a video, we have a map. Another tool might not have a map, or you need to buy a plugin to have a map, or you're just not going to do it, or you need to code it one way, right? Bubble has a map. I can just drag it and I have a map. I can configure it and I have a map, right? And if you want to learn how to configure it, I actually have a video, a separate video on doing maps with Bubble. So you can search the channel for that and you can understand how to do it if you're interested in that. So that is what I'm doing here, right? Another thing I'm doing is, and we're gonna get more into that in a second. But if I'm doing input, right? I'm doing input. I want to know how to read that input, right? This is getting into workflows a little bit, but still, this is still UI because if I have an input, so if I go in here, this is how I name my input in Bubble. So I can just say something like my input, whatever, or like, name, input name. Okay, that's it. Now, when I enter it, I can have a placeholder. All of this is optional, obviously, but this is important because this is required. When I enter something here, I want to know how it reads it. So that is why when I go into my workflow, so let's say, I have a button here, I have a button, right? We're doing UI, right? And we can say submit or click me or whatever. And when I click on it, I go to my workflow and I can say, well, we have a data, we want to create a new thing, and I want to, create a new type, type 1, whatever, it doesn't really matter. And I can set my fields. I can say, well, this is going to be a field. Actually, let's do this. I can say that send an email. And this tool becomes dynamic data. And I can say, well, I can scroll down. I can go in here. I can scroll down. Let's say this is a subject. Okay, I can say dynamic data. And what do I have? I have input name, value. Okay, now I understand. I understand that if I label this field input value, input name, Okay, and then I go into workflow here, and every single field in any situation, I can just pull up this dynamic field, and it's going to have input name. So take a look at this. There's lots of things I can do, but you see this? Input name. That is, and it even previews it for you, which is really, really cool. Actually, it even previews it, but I don't pay too much attention to that because I know what I labeled my elements, right? So now I have my value. Now I understand. Now I've linked, right? This is kind of what I did. I've linked this UI to the controller. Okay? So when it comes to UI, this is kind of all I'm looking at. There's probably other things that I'm looking at right now, like how does a button trigger a workflow? And that's very simple. I can just come in here and I can just click here and I can, it says start edit workflow when the element is clicked. That's it. Now I understand. I understand my elements. I know my repeating group. I know what is a dynamic field, right? This placeholder, everything in Bubble can be made dynamic, which is very nice. And that's the case with all no-code tools because that is very, very important. I know what this is labeled here, and I know how to get it back. I know how to do something with it because if you don't have a submit button, you don't have anything, then you just have a web page. You don't have an app, right? An app needs to do something with the data, right? It needs to get this data and do something. That's really the purpose of an app. If you're not doing anything, if you don't have any logic, you don't have an app. You just have a web page, right? That's the main difference. And so that concludes my UI analysis. Now I understand it, right? And that is the first thing that I do whenever I start working with a new tool. I start looking for patterns. I start figuring out what do they call the repeating group? Well, in Appgyver, it's called a list or something else. In Adalo, it's called a list. In backend list, it's called something. Thunkable, it's called something else. That is what I'm looking for. Once I understand that, that's half the battle right there, right? That's half the battle right there. The next thing, we're going to look at the controller and workflow. We're not yet looking at the data layer. That's not that important just yet. We're going to get there. But I'm looking at the controller and workflow. And really, one may argue that this is even more important than the UI. The UI is going to be the UI, right? The UI is going to be standard. But this workflow is very, very important. So if I go into Bubble and I go to the workflow tab, I can do my workflows here. Now, what is the workflow? Workflow, or logic, or controller, or whatever you call it, right? Doesn't matter. Every app calls it using its own names. But this is the heart of an app, right? Like I said before, if you just have a UI, you don't have the actual logic, nothing is doing. It's not interactive. It's not giving you something new. It's not calculating. It's like a calculator, right? An app really is like a complicated form of a calculator, right? The calculator just does some kind of arithmetic, right? Adds, subtracts, multiplies, divides, stuff like that. An app does more, but it's the same thing, really. It's kind of in the same spirit. And that is what I'm looking for. So with Bubble, you can have workflows that get triggered, right? When I click submit, when I do something else, like when I can start a workflow here, right? When text hello world is clicked, right? It allows me to do that. Now, different apps, they do it a different way. Not all apps do it like Bubble does it, right? Some apps do it differently. Some apps allow you to create something called a binding, something called an event. So this thing here, it can have multiple events. Like if I start typing, that's an event. If I erase, that's an event. If I mouse over, that's an event. If I mouse out, that's an event. All of these are events. With Bubble, I do not believe you can do all that. With Bubble, it's actually very simple. You just click on it, and that triggers an event, and then you can launch a workflow from that. But there are other tools like Backendless, other tools that allow you to kind of fine-tune it in many, many ways. So the other thing that I'm looking for is, okay, I click the button. Let's add an action. What can I do? Well, there's a custom event. There's plugins. We don't have any plugins, but if I had a plugin, I would have plugin actions. And I have a video on Bubble plugins on the channel. Search this channel to find that video. I have element actions, right? I can show a specific element. I can set focus. I can display data. I can, I have repeating group, display list, etc. So this is all with elements. Basically, I can manipulate the UI. Analytics, we're not going to talk about that. Payment, This is whenever you are using like a Stripe plugin, and I have a video regarding that as well. You can search the channel for that too. We have an email, which is nice, which is cool. Send an email, send a meeting request, install more email actions. We have data. This is really nice, right? This data thing. I can create a new thing. And what new thing? Well, we're going to talk about that in a second. This new thing is a data entity. Well, right now, by default, Bubble gives us users, right? So people that log in, change passwords, stuff like that. Later on, you can add your own entity. Maybe it's going to be customers, clients. Maybe it's going to be orders, products, whatever, depending on your app. And here's where Bubble shines, because you can create a new entity, make changes. So I can say make changes. And what are we changing? We're changing current user. And what are we doing to that current user? Well, we can create a new field to change, right? We can do a search for user where email is equal to a special field. I can say, well, email@email.com. That means we need to find that user and then change something about that user, right? And as a result, this data thing here is very, very powerful. You can do things here inside Bubble that otherwise would take a lot of time, would be very, very painful, and would, get you to do a lot more work than you really need to. I really love this thing. I use this thing all the time, right? A lot of these other things, send an email is just a transactional event, right? Something happened, we need to do something. That's called a transactional event. This data thing is awesome. I can copy, I can delete list of things. And when you're designing an app, you might have a user that has a list of products, or a user might have a list of customers, or so many things. And here you can just delete this whole list of orders. Or maybe a user has a shopping cart, right, which is a list of products. And here you can just delete this whole list very, very easily. I can say delete type of things, user, and, well, this is not going to be user. This is going to be something else, products that are connected to that user, right? Very, very powerful thing. And this is all part of the logic. This is all part of things that you can do. And there's other things that you can do, right? Where you can create your own plugin, and that plugin can create events for you. So for instance, if I click here, right, this is going to be part of the custom event. So for instance, I have here an app, my Stripe demo. So if I go in here, you will see what I mean. This Stripe demo actually uses a plugin called a Stripe plugin here. So if I go into my workflows, you see that I have various custom events when Stripe Pay has been created, when a Stripe token has been created. This is not by default with Bubble. This is an asynchronous event. It gets launched automatically when something happens. So for instance, I can go in here and I have elements, and I can say, well, when this event happens, it's not like I'm clicking a button or highlighting on an element. So when an external event happens, maybe a credit card has been approved, I can do this. So I can do that, and then I can actually launch an action, right? It's very, very powerful with Bubble. And all of this is part of the logic. This is kind of what I'm looking at. What kind of things that I can do? Can I navigate to another page? Navigation, go to page, refresh the page, go to previous page, right? This is very, very powerful. There's also workflows, and there's lots of even things that, you might not even use. Like there's lots of functionality that I've never used in my work just yet. And that is what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out, what can I do? Like I said, it's possible in some tools to do even more than Bubble is giving you. So for instance, if I hover over, Bubble doesn't know, doesn't care really, right? If I come in here, this thing is when I click on it. But what if I start typing, right? That needs to be a custom thing. It's not possible to do it directly. What I'm doing is I'm looking at functionality. I'm looking what's available. I'm looking what I can do to get me to the point of finishing the app. Very, very important. But really, the key here is that if I click on this, I have an action. I'm looking, always look at these various actions, because this is what Bubble is exposing you. This is the functionality that's being exposed to you. Who knows? Maybe you have a tool that only allows you to do account and navigation, but none of this. Or maybe it allows you to do data and nothing else. It's really up to the tool, right? In this case, Bubble is nice enough to allow us to do various things. But maybe Bubble could have given us even more control. Maybe it could have given us less control, right? We do not control that. This is part of the tool. This is what the developers of the tool decided is important and useful for us, okay? So that was control of workflows and logic. Last but not least, we are going to talk about data. And the reason I put it last is because data is one of those things that is different in every tool. Some tools give you a certain way of doing data. Other times they give you a different way. Let me show you what I mean. So with Bubble, right? If I go back to Bubble, I have my data. Bubble gives you an ability to create an internal database, meaning that I can create a database, right? I have this type 1. We're going to delete this type. We don't really need it. But I have a user here. I can create a new type customer. Okay? Create that. I can create a new type product. I can do a new type car. Let's say we have a site about cars, model, whatever. All of this is here. And then I can go to app data and I can pick all cars and I can create a new entry. Okay? Type of thing, car. And I can go in here. Data types. I can create a new field, name. Car name. This is text. Right? Bubble is very, very generous. Another thing that Bubble allows you to do, and this is something that I'm looking for when I'm studying and learning about a specific tool, is API stuff, right? This is an internal database. Typically, you're going to have two ways of doing it, generally speaking. There are a lot more than two ways, but typically, you're going to have two ways of accessing data, internal data and external data. So external, you need an API. Bubble does not come with this plugin, right? This plugin here, if I uninstall it, this is what Bubble comes with. But I can add a plugin. I can click here. I can type API and I can add this thing. It's used by 354,000 apps. It's built by Bubble. This is, their core plugin. I can hit done. And now I have an API connector that allows me to get external data and use it. And this means the whole world is open to me. I can use an external API from this side, from that side. There's a site called Rapid API where I can get free API, or I can also purchase API calls. And this makes my app a lot richer, right? But it's also great that I have internal data. So Bubble kind of gives you the best of both worlds. That's not the case with other apps, right? Like I said, Appgyver, for instance, does not have an internal API, okay? It only has an external API, okay? So that's a little different. Adalo has an internal API, internal database. But if you want to use external, you have to pay. You have to join the plan and you have to pay a little bit extra, right? So if you go in pricing here, you can see that you got to jump on the next plan. I believe it's this plan here. Connect to external data collections. Yeah, you need to pay $50 a month. With Bubble, it's free. With Bubble, you don't need to do that. Thunkable, right? Thunkable has its own thing. You can connect to Google Sheets. You can connect to a bunch of other apps that you can't do with Bubble that easily, right? You can do, there's all these things. So for instance, if I log in, let me show you. And I go to one of my apps and I go in here to this data source and I add a data source and I create a new data source. This is what I can do with Thunkable. I can create my own table. This is internal storage. I can connect to an Airtable, which is an app that, kind of like a data, kind of like a spreadsheet, but with some extra features. I can connect to Google Sheets or I can connect to Webflow, right? This is kind of what I'm able to do. So I'm always looking, can I have my internal data? If not, what about external data? If not external data, then what? That is what I'm trying to do. So with Bubble, you kind of have the best of both worlds. You can test your things out with internal data. And then when you're ready, you can connect to some external data, or the other way around. You can test with external data, which is also a great possibility. And then when you're ready, you can start using internal data. It's really up to you. You can do it both ways. And I've made countless videos showing you exactly how to do that, right? So it's all on the channel. I have tons and tons of videos where you can kind of learn how to do that. And the next thing you want to think about is what kind of data relationship are done, right? So with Bubble, it's kind of like a relational, this internal thing is kind of like a relational database, right? So for instance, let's say I have a customer, I can create a new field and I can say cars, right? This customer's cars, and I can say car. And this has a multiple entries. So now it means that this customer has a list of cars. So let's say we're tracking, how many cars they have. Maybe we run some kind of a car service, a car mechanic kind of shop, kind of store. We have customers and they have a list of cars. And now we created one car here, and we can come in here and we can create a list of cars. So then that way, when I go to app data and I want to go into customer and I want to say new entry, I can add cars from the other entity. So if I can go into cars, I can create, let's say we go to car, we have names, so I can go to app data, I can say not new view, new entry, and I can say this is BMW. I can create it. And so that way I have a customer, and this customer has a list of cars, and that way when I go to app data, I can do a new entry for, I can pick customer, right? And I can add cars, existing cars. So like, let's say we have cars, we have a BMW, we have a Toyota, we have a Mercedes-Benz, and then I can add them as part of the customer in case they have these specific models. And this is called a relationship database, because I can create relationships. That's not automatically how it's going to be with other systems, right? If you're able to connect to a remote source, you might have to do it a different way, right? You might have to model your app to be a different way. You might have relationships there already in the system, right? You might be getting data that's already has relationships. Whereas with Bubble, if you're doing something internal, you need to create relationships. With Adalo, it has an internal database as well, and it also has relationships, but they're a little bit different than this thing. It's similar, but different. It works different. Once you start working with Adalo, you will see. And so that's the kind of the database. I'm always thinking like, okay, is there internal, is there external, what are the relationships, stuff like that. And that, in a nutshell, is our data layer. There's a lot more, stuff to cover, but that's really kind of in the beginning. And so just to kind of wrap things up, we have the UI. We have the visual elements, we have the input, we have the repeating group, or in Appgyver it's called the list. In various things, it's kind of it has its own name, but that's very, very important, because most of the time you're going to be using a repeating group just to show data, or show a report, or show what you have. Very, very important. Next, we have the workflow logic, right? This is kind of the heart, right? So I'll just make it like red, because this is really the heart. What can you do? What does it allow you to do, right? If I go into Thunkable and I come in here, I can do, I have various things here, right? Let's say I have an element here, I have a button, I can put it here. And this button, what can I do with this button, right? We have this button here, I can go to blocks, and now I have my logic here. This is kind of where the logic is. So if I click on this data viewer, right? So we have this data viewer here. This is our data viewer, right? This is kind of what's being displayed. And I go to blocks and I click on my button. This is what I can do with the button, right? I can say when button is touched up, when it's touched down, when it's long click, when it's click, right? You can't do this with Bubble. Bubble only has click. This thing has, look at this. I have all of these events, right? I can do that. I'm going to kill that. I can go back to button, long click, touch down, touch up. I can set the text. You can do that with Bubble as well. You can, background picture, all computed height, computed width. You can change all of these parameters. But with Bubble, you can't do that. You can only react on this click. You can't react on long click, touch down, touch up. So that could be useful for somebody. We have this data viewer, right, in Thunkable. You have item click, left swipe click, right swipe click, refresh data. All of these things that might not be available in the other tool, right? Very, very important when it comes to logic. In Thunkable, for instance, you have access to devices, seconds online, current hour, current time, platform, color scheme, right? You have access to, you can go to other things. You have speech, you have sound, you have camera, you have so many things that you can do that you might not be able to do with the other tool. This is all part of logic, controller, workflow, whatever you want to call it, that's all part of that. And last but not least, we have data, right? So data is going to be different for every app. With Bubble, you have internal, you can do APIs. With other things, you have Google Sheets. Maybe with Thunkable, you have very interesting forms of data, right? You can come in here and you can add data, and you can say create new. You have Airtable, you have Google Sheets, Webflow. So Bubble only has this, right? It doesn't have these three, but Bubble also has a REST API, which could be useful. So that is kind of what you have to be looking at. The key here is that you need to know what to look for. You can't just be looking at a tool like you're seeing, it for the first time in your life. You need to know what to look for. It's like when you're, visiting a city, right? You need to figure out how much is the ride from the airport to the center. What kind of currency do they take? You know what to look for. You're not, this is not your first time in a city, right? You know what to look for. What kind of currency do they have? Is it euros, dollars? Is it something else? What kind of language they speak? You know what to look for. Same thing with these tools. That is the secret to learning them fast. And that is why I easily learn any tool that's out there. I can learn tools very, very quickly. And as a result, I made tons and tons of videos on lots of different tools. All right, guys. So that is what I wanted to cover today. Really hope you've gotten value here. If you did, smash the like button. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Let me know what kind of tool you're working with or what kind of tool you are planning on learning. And also don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of these videos about building apps, building different tools, web pages, whatever you want to call it, without writing a single line of code. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.